Thank
That
you.
makes sense?
It does.
Okay.
Apologies to my colleagues.
We've made other accommodations in the past for other departments, so we do it when we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, committee members. Nice to see you again. Mr. Bigelow, welcome. I look forward to working with you. What I'd like to do quickly is describe the governor's proposed budget allocation for our department relative to drought, which includes kind of 7 focal areas, and give you express examples under each area of work done in the current year. So the proposal for our department is broadly a continuation of what we've been doing for several years now. We agree with the analysis in the LAO report that, quote, multiple years in dry conditions have had severe effects on the environment, and we appreciate the staff recommendation to approve these items. So this year, the proposal for our department is $17.7 million. Of that, $15,650,000 is general fund, and $2 million is us using one of our own funds, our Hatcheries Inland Fisheries Fund. And that would also include positions for 13, which are just a continuation of limited term positions previously approved to manage through this drought. And the money would be allocated across these 7 basic activity areas. The first is providing emergency help for winter run salmon in the Sacramento and spring run Chinook salmon, as well as our native fish in the Delta. So 4 years into this, I think it's safe to say that for some of our rarest and most imperiled species, drought has produced an existential crisis. We've had back-to-back years of at least 95% mortality in our young winter-run salmon in the Sacramento system. A spring ago, we were sampling in the Delta for our native smelt fish, and in March of a year ago, we pulled 6 in one of our surveys. The year before, 88. In April of a year ago, we pulled 1. The year before, 36. And in last spring, May, in something that's never happened before, we found 0, which is probably the loneliest number. This spring, we're back out doing the trials, and I think in January we pulled 7, and in February we pulled 6. I might have those numbers transposed. So things we've done in just the last year and the current budget year include improving our monitoring network. We're way behind the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia in doing basic technological advancements like putting tiny sensors in the fish, like building a temperature logging network around the Sacramento Delta so the Department of Water Resources, my department, our federal colleagues can see more precisely where the fish are at any given moment in time, and then make finer scale adjustments on water operations to achieve both supply and resource protection. We took some of the money, we partnered with Reclamation District 108, and we fixed at least a decade-old problem around Knight's Landing, where there's been a gate not adequately screened there. And in 2013, we had 600 winter run stray into the Colusa Basin and get lost hundreds of miles from their journey up the Sacramento. So we fixed that problem. Those are examples of things we've done and will continue to do in that topical area. The next program area for us is our own lands. We own and manage about 1 million acres. And we're outdated in managing for water efficiencies on our own properties. So just in the last couple of years, we've taken about 300,000 acres of our own properties, and we've created about 50 water efficiency plans for our own properties. And we're investing in things like lining our own canals, getting off groundwater to the extent we can, doing more collaborative leasing and trading of water with our neighboring irrigation districts to where we can keep the highest priority wetlands wet. The next area is monitoring and rescue. So in January of 14, the governor's executive order on drought, and there's been 3 or 4 of them, directed our department outside the Delta to work around the state, track health of native fish, and do what we can. Just in this current budget year, And in total, we've done 930 fish rescues around the state in 67 of the highest priority watersheds to move and save about 270,000 fish across 38 different types of fish species. We would continue that work. The next area is dealing with our hatcheries. In the prior years, we've done important upgrades to prevent disease outbreak, to reduce the risk of a commercial salmon failure, and we've done a lot of trucking and barging of fish because the river conditions have been too lethal. What we would propose to do in the coming year is apply that learned lesson to our trout hatcheries. And these investments are things like purchasing chillers to keep the water in the hatchery below lethal levels. We have hatcheries below some of the federal dams. When reservoirs are so low, the incoming water to our hatcheries is too hot, and we have massive fish die-offs. So we'll be turning to our trout hatchery system this year. Next area is our law enforcement. At a most basic level, this proposed budget would allow us to continue our overtime for our wardens. Just in fiscal year 15-16 so far, we've had our wardens spend a total of almost 8,500 hours responding to 2,000 plus calls from the public about human-wildlife conflicts. We've seen animals in places we don't typically see them because of the drought. We would continue that work. We've also had about 771 drought-related calls come into our anonymous hotline, CalTips. A good percentage of those, we believe, are coming out of the North Coast related to the cultivation of marijuana. And we've referred about 333 reports to the State Water Board related to that sphere of activity, which often is illegal water diversion occurring at the expense of a landowner adjacent who's taken the time to be lawful in their diversions. Two last areas. Actually, one last area. Terrestrial monitoring. The hardest hit species often are our terrestrial critters that rely on unique pool habitat in otherwise really dry places. Go figure, out near Death Valley, there's actually, when it rains, a mosaic of wetland habitat that provides habitat for an animal like the Amorosa vole. We think there maybe are 100 of them on the planet. We've brought about 20 into captivity with our federal partners, something we did last year. And in our captive breeding program, we've turned that 20 into 90. So that when that habitat is ready again, because it's wet, we believe we'll be able to take them back from Noah's Ark and replant them. We would continue that kind of work on the terrestrial landscape. So with that, I'll stop and see if you have any questions. So spread across those 7 topical areas and continuing the work we've done over the last 4 years.
Thank you very much for the report. We'll move on to Department of Water Resources Director Cowan.
Good morning, Chair Bloom, members of the committee. I am Mark Cowan, Director of the Department of Water Resources. Let me step back for just a moment and first of all endorse the LAO's report on current drought conditions. We've provided the members a one-page handout with the most current numbers. The message is very similar to what you've already heard and probably hear on the news. The first 2 weeks of March have been very welcome. We've seen reservoirs in Northern California come up to above average levels, which is an improvement over anything we've seen over the past 3 years. So very welcome indeed. However, I would turn your attention to the graphic on the back page of our handout, which shows the percent of average precipitation on a statewide basis with color coding. And clearly the Southern Sierra and most of the southern part of the state are still well below normal. So the simple message here is that we're seeing better water conditions than we've seen over the past 3 or 4 years, but we are far from out of drought conditions on a statewide basis, and we need to continue to plan and act accordingly. If I could just comment quickly on the Chair's comments about drought preparedness. I agree with the Chair's remarks about the need for preparedness. I think I would amend slightly your statement, Chair Bloom. I don't think we've seen uniform preparedness or performance during drought across California. It's been quite diverse, and clearly one of the lessons I think that we can point to is that those communities that learned from previous drought experience and made the right policy adjustments and made the right investments have suffered less drought effects than those that haven't, for whatever reason, lack of funding, lack of will, lack of the right policies. But my sense is, moving forward, our job at the state level is to increase the level of drought preparedness, improve the standards for drought contingency planning for all communities across California moving forward, and doing whatever we can to be sure that when the next drought rolls around, be it as severe as the drought we've been facing the last 3 or 4 years, or even more severe, that we're better prepared to deal with those conditions at the local, regional level. And of course, the state will be there to provide backup as needed. If I could jump into our budget requests quickly, similar to the previous director's reports, I think our proposals that are included in the governor's budget follow along the lines of continuing the programs that we've implemented over the last 2 or 3 years. We have a total of $64 million in requests for drought response funding this year, the bulk of which, of course, is the $42 million for the Delta salinity barrier. Let me say quickly that I believe our experience installing an emergency salinity barrier on West Falls River in the western part of the Delta in 2015 proved to be successful. It did what we wanted it to do. It protected water quality for folks that divert water directly from the Delta, and of course for the state and federal water projects as well. We estimate that we were able to preserve about 90,000 acre-feet of water in upstream reservoirs because the barrier was in place. If that barrier had not been in place, we would have been forced to release that water to repel salinity back into the sea. So while it's a very expensive endeavor, I think it has paid off, and we would endorse moving forward with a similar program under similar conditions in the future. I think it's safe to say now, given the March storms and where we stand with Northern California reservoirs, that we will not need to install a barrier in 2016. Endorse the committee's recommended action to hold this part of the proposal over. We would like to work with the committee to bring forward a revised budget proposal based upon the current conditions. I'll note, however, that because the budget cycle doesn't line up with the timing for barrier installation removal, what we're actually asking for here is funding to remove a barrier in 2016, plus funding to install a barrier should drought persist into 2017. So it's the contingency of having funding available to install a barrier in 2017 that we're still interested in preserving. Moving on quickly to just 3 other areas of drought response. We're requesting $12 million to support our basic drought response activities. This is the management, coordination, and planning, the capacity to provide local assistance and generally assess drought conditions and responses. Includes our capacity to expedite water transfers. Another area is $5 million for local assistance specifically to provide to disadvantaged communities. The funding really serves 2 purposes. First of all, just the immediate emergency water supplies needed for public health concerns, and secondly, to contribute to cost-effective long-term solutions for those disadvantaged communities. And then finally, $5 million to continue our Save Our Water campaign. I think we believe that the campaign has been successful in getting drought messaging out, providing useful tips on how the everyday citizen can save water in their household. So we would like to be able to continue that work and start to transition towards the citizens' response to making water conservation a way of life as opposed to just an emergency response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if there's no questions, we'll move on to the State Water Resources Control Board. Alicia Marcus.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be able to follow my operations department's colleagues. Our portion of activities is smaller, obviously, than the folks who are doing major operations all the time, and all of them have done incredible heavy lifting with amazing impacts on the ground for people. I'll add my agreement with the LAO recommendations, including the ones for lessons learned and figuring out how to capture the lessons and stay in gear about that. The thing I would add is, and it may have felt oversaid, but no one said it yet today, but we did look at the issue of preparing for droughts in the same family as looking longer term, responding to the chairman's comments, and that's what the Water Action Plan was all about. It was looking at 30 years, 20 years, who knows from now, as population growth and climate change make our conflicts even greater. There's no time like the present to do all of these things, some of which we're talking about today, but a lot of which for the long term are critical: weather efficiency, recycling, stormwater capture, desal in the appropriate circumstances, how to do all of the above belt suspenders Velcro that we really need to do and that we can do to meet a water future sustainably, thinking thoughtfully about groundwater management, which the legislature and the administration rose to the occasion on a couple of years ago, and folks on the ground are doing the very hard work of struggling to figure out how to prepare for the future. So as the drought hit, we had the advantage of accelerating what we knew to be important, not just for the drought response, but for a more sustainable future for the state. So the two are intertwined, and it's great that we already had that going for us as we were moving into this particular drought, where our drought prep kind of got overtaken by events, but we've had some on-the-job experience. And while the metaphor of Godzilla has perhaps been overused during the drought, this has been the Godzilla of all wake-up calls, not just for our next drought, but for the future, and I think we're all taking it very seriously. So the notion of not just doing lessons learned for the short term, but documenting them, I think is a very good idea. I know we dusted off our old dry year reports as we were going into this, and even did workshops to hear whether those lessons were the right ones. In our budget, we have, I'll put it in two categories of drought activities that we need to continue, whether the drought continues or not. Both, we know that drought conditions are still severe in many parts of the state. As one of Mark's colleagues said at our hearing yesterday, in looking at the good news on being at average in some of our reservoirs, large ones, average, yay. So we're excited about average because it's been so dismal, but we're still average in some places, and we're well below average in others. So we are very much still in drought, although we're grateful for every drop we've gotten, which will allow us to ease up on some things, but not on many. So the two categories for us deal with financial assistance in drinking water, primarily for disadvantaged communities, and our water rights arena, which is in part implementation of the state's water rights laws, curtailments in time of shortage, et cetera, but also balancing off the ecosystem needs with water users. And a few areas to highlight there. The financial assistance you've allowed us to use to deal with communities running out of drinking water has been money well spent. It takes a lot of people to be out there figuring out where to go and looking at the very real methods for getting water to people. Much is made of the water being delivered to communities in bottles and tankers, et cetera, but that's a piece of it. The lion's share of our money goes for working with those small public water supply systems over 15 that we actually regulate, and what we're doing there is we're looking at emergency pipelines, new wells, new facilities, interties between communities where we're getting funding that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to get quickly to small communities that can make all the difference in the world. You also gave us the ability a little bit later last year to be able to use a portion of it in concert with our colleagues at DWR and the Office of Emergency Services to deal with folks we don't normally regulate, smaller systems and domestic well owners, so that we can make some of that money available. So it's a lot of work for the people trying to figure out what to do, get the paperwork done, the analysis, but also just getting the money out the door. On water rights, largely the big ticket item, again, as the LAO suggested, has been information. Just The lack of basic information that we've had is one of those mysteries to people outside of California in terms of what we do and don't know about how much water users are doing. I mean, if you go to some other states like Colorado, where they've adjudicated all their water rights, you can't even capture water off your rooftop without getting a water rights permit because it's all been calculated in the flows. That said, I think in this drought, folks have really risen to the occasion, not just the funding and the authorities the legislature has given us, but even in the stakeholder water users communities to understand that information is actually our friend and a way in which we can implement the water rights system in a more precise way. So through those information orders, through that work that our staff has done, working a lot with stakeholders, we have much better information to deal with. Is it perfect? No, we still have a long way to go. We finally got our metering and measurement regs in place that you gave us the authority. But I think we've had an amazing convergence of opinion on that. It just takes a lot of work. So we still have a lot of work to do on modeling and information. We also have a lot of work to do just in implementing curtailments at thousands of inspections and the like. We're in the enforcement arena. Some of those are going to go for a number of years because of the process in that. So even should the drought end, which we would all be very happy, we're still going to have a lot of cleanup work to do, not just in getting enforcement cases through the system, but also in being able to work with our colleagues at the other agencies in figuring out how to get ahead of the curve in those places where you have conflicts between fish and wildlife and people, and how to set those really bare minimum flows so that we can work, whether it's in the Russian River or in other areas. So plenty of work to do, and we appreciate the staffing we've had. Folks we do have are working around the clock, it feels like, all the time.
Thank you. And, Godzilla's got enough problems. I don't think it's fair to use Godzilla as a foil for our water issues.
He's a misunderstood icon. Definitely true.
For a monster, very misunderstood. Let's move on now to the Department of Food and Agriculture. We are missing. Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Go right ahead. No, And I asked for questions at each juncture, and I failed to do it in this one.
And I appreciate
please.
That. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a number of the comments that you presented there. I thought that was kind of interesting to use the Godzilla terminology and to lead us into that, because I thought when we look at this drought, sometimes we look at it in the real sense of what's there. And then we have to start looking back. And there is a lot of historical data that shows this isn't the first drought in the state's history. In fact, there's been many others, some of greater magnitude. So as we understand that, we need to understand how come we find ourselves with less water, though, even though we've got the best storage systems in place. Unfortunately, some of the answers are not the ones that we want to hear necessarily. And one of the ones that I've seen is the fact that we are managing it as a state government agency more, and we're diverting more of that water from its way it was once managed, when we were able to get through all of these droughts more effectively. But too much of the water has been diverted to more of the environmental needs for fish, if you will, over people. And I think there's a way that we can do this better working together. Unfortunately, we saw lakes drained needlessly. In fact, I saw a lake that I had the great privilege of going up and representing and asked a simple question. If only 30,000 cubic feet per second is going out and you're asking for 110,000, and the water that's remaining, where that 110,000 cubic feet per second will come from, is coming from a lake that you have as listed here as one of the lowest in storage at this moment because it was so heavily drained. That water went downstream for the fish at the cost of the people who had actually stored that water for their domestic needs. It was their water, not the state's, not the fish. People paid to store that water there. Unfortunately, they were trumped. So the question that I have for you is, when the drought emergency is over, what powers do you intend to hand back to your sister agencies? And what permitting water right changes do you plan to rescind? Is your first question. And for instance, will the temperature plan be rescinded and placed in the proper context of an evidentiary process?
There's a lot in that.
Yes, there is.
And
I'm only new to the committee.
No, I
This
know.
is my
and
first day.
there are longer conversation to be had. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of those comments, though I've heard them over and over again. So I think part of the challenge, and I'll turn to my colleagues if I oversimplify this, is clearly there are fish and wildlife requirements put on both by the State Water Board water quality control planning process and by the state and federal fish agency processes that are important for fish and wildlife. You also have, in all of those dams, there is, you're supposed to keep the fish in good condition below the dams under state law, so it's not, no one is in isolation. I'll also say that there's a tremendous amount of let me just say talking points, fervently held on all sides. It's not, and they make the rounds of the water coolers as if they're true. But in fact, there's a tremendous amount of multiple needs that are put on our storage facilities. A lot of those requirements come through a fully evidentiary held adjudicatory process on water rights and resolutions to them that talk about what the relative responsibilities for meeting those fish and wildlife standards are. Those were the laws, those were the rules that were agreed to. In the course of this drought, our agency, as well as the fish agencies, have flexed considerably to try and minimize and kind of tread a middle path and find a sweet spot, whether you're talking about Shasta temperature or any of the other flow standards. I think they've done heroic work, and they're being pilloried for giving away the store. As Director Bonham said, I think well-intentioned people guessed well and tried to deal with maintaining salinity control in the Delta, which is a lot of where that water goes, and people seem to forget that if that water didn't go for that, it wouldn't be good for anybody in the Delta or for export. And so it's a very complex system where people take a couple of facts and can weave a good story. And I think this is where the information becomes really important. We need to have the real information so we can have a real conversation about where the arguments are versus arguing past each other. And again, all sides do this. But I've heard these talking points, and the talking points aren't actually the reality of the facts. And let me talk another one to you that I can't give you the precise numbers. I hear the talking points about how in X drought it was this bad and we got this much water. So the less water must, I'm not saying this well, must be all because of fish and wildlife regulations. And it's just not. There are lots of more people with more straws being diverted from the Delta, both surface water and groundwater right next to it. So part of the reason there's less water coming through is there are other water users taking more water too. And I haven't seen that able to be charted out because we don't have the best information about all of this, about depletions and all of that. So it is a very complex picture, but I would agree that we need to get that data out there so that we can have a more useful conversation, because having the useful conversation benefits everybody. And I think in particular, a point that you alluded to that I also don't buy into is the notion that we have somehow taken away authority from the projects and we're managing the projects. We are not. We are managing people's water rights permits the way they are supposed to be managed. And if anything, we've cut slack to the water rights holders, and we've cut fish flows considerably to try and deal with a crisis of historical magnitude. So we're all just trying to do the best we can do. And I have an incredible amount of respect for the project operators and the fish agencies who have really struggled to deal not only with their own authorities, but recognition of the other entities' authorities. And we, as the State Water Board, it may not feel this way from the rhetoric you see, we sit in what I see as not the enviable position, but our job is to balance them all and try to maximize everybody's interest. So it means everybody's also unhappy. So that's one of those things where information is our friend, because then we can we'll still be arguing about things, but we can argue about things that are real versus talking points. And again, this is true on all sides. It's not